afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of the Mashreq Sustainable Finance Dialogues, a podcast series focused on how to get the finance corridor alongside all of the other corridors that are so critical for companies and countries to reach net zero by 2050, some by 2060, others, but ultimately it's a critical component. And not only is it critical in the greater scheme of things, but in this window of time in which COP27 is about to take place in Egypt, it's even more critical because, of course, sustainable finance is a cornerstone to the Egyptian focus for this year's COP and bringing the developing and emerging economies up to the level in which the commitments have been made to. So hitting the ground running, that's the theme this afternoon. COP27 as a platform for green finance to advance and most critically advance the shift from pledging to implementation. Of course, that is the big momentum change in which Egypt wants to achieve this year. And certainly it's time to stop sort of talking the talk rather, and start walking the walk. And that's hopefully what the Egyptians will succeed in doing as they gather the world at Sharm el-Sheikh. Let's kick off with our host today and give Tomas Jacobs, Senior Vice President, Head of Strategy at Mashreq Bank, the opportunity to make some opening thoughts, give us a sense of where he thinks this subject is going.
Great. Thank you, Sean. So look, as the host, so I would say welcome, dear Simone, Damien and Sean, And on behalf of Mashreq, I would say it is my great pleasure and privilege to invite you to this session as part of the Mashreq Sustainable Finance Dialogues. I think this is a very timely discussion with COP27 just around the corner, and even more so as COP27 is being held under the theme of Together for Implementation, and with a view to renewing and extending the agreements that was reached in the historic Paris Agreement. I think it's worth mentioning that this COP27 is also known as the African COP, because one of the issues to be addressed is the need for greater financial resources and improved access to funds, especially for developing countries. Mashreq is proud to be one of the sponsors of COP27, and we are acutely aware of the need to deliver more innovative financing solutions to help developing countries with mitigation and adaptation. I think it's a matter of pride for us that we have facilitated $11.7 billion worth of sustainable finance deals since October 2020 across the region. This across GCC, India, Turkey, and Africa. We're also in quite a few active discussions with several entities that are looking to explore sustainable financing for the first time, providing them with guidance and advice. So this is what actually makes Mashreq's involvement in COP27, and particularly in Finance Day, where we actually are on some of the panels also, a timely one. And I believe this discussion will be a good precursor to that. I think with that, I will hand it back to Sean.
Thank you very much. Let's welcome Simone Uttermark, the Director of Sustainable Finance at the International Capital Market Association. And most notably, I think quite important, Simone manages the principles which underpin the global sustainable bond market. And of course, setting of standards are so critical for all capital markets and particularly for emerging markets to access capital. So Simone, I welcome your opening thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. And just to clarify, so ICMA or ICMA, the International Capital Market Association that I work for since 2014, has been providing the secretariat for what's known now as the principles. Started off with the green bond principles, but now we also have the social bond principles, sustainability bond guidelines for a mix of green and social, and the sustainability-linked bond principles that focus more on the strategy of an issuer. So we provide the secretariat, but the principles are actually created and further developed by a market-led initiative. So that's issuers, investors, and underwriters in sustainable bonds, which is also why I think they have been so successful and continue to be so successful. So in relation to COP27, as you know, over the years, sustainable bonds have really emerged as one of the main instruments to finance what is green, but also finance what is social. And more importantly, increasingly, we look at the transition. So you can also use a green bond or a sustainability linked bond, for example, to finance the climate transition or the other side of the coin, the just transition, the social side.
Let's welcome Damien Regan, Sustainability Reporting and Assurance Leader for Deloitte Middle East. Damien, we have Egypt adopting Africa as its vision on Finance Day, which is November 9. So right in the middle of this very important COP27 Finance Day, with all of the finance ministers gathered, looking at facilitating capital for emerging markets in particular, for African countries in particular, to make green projects more bankable. Your thoughts on the theme this morning?
Okay, well, I think it's a great theme. It's a very important theme for climate change. I think there are three key drivers to what's going to happen. One is we need to have behaviour change and commitments from companies and countries towards this green evolution. Secondly, we need technology to come in to help save the day, as it were, to help reduce carbon in the atmosphere and think of new ways for companies to change their emissions. But thirdly, you need the finance for it, and the finance drives everything. And so finding that finance, particularly for the private sector, is very important. Seeking the green dollar is very important to be able to put that money back into that technology, particularly, and help the transition of companies from old to new, countries old to new economies. So I think getting the finance is important, a focus on finance is important, but it's also important to think about, well, how is it being done? Because there's a lot of greenwashing, there's a lot of hype around investing in green. Investors don't always know what that means. Indeed, companies looking for finance don't always know how to present themselves to actually attract that green dollar. So I think the ICMA principle has been around a number of years, very important to help define how that finance can be used in the structure of the entities. But the bit
would you identify? Sorry to interrupt you there. That I mean, there's many reasons, perhaps, that opportunities, and the data indicates that, you know, it's growing, the flow is growing. But ultimately, if we take the Paris Climate Agreement 2015 commitment of $100 billion a year to the emerging economies from the rich economies, we're way behind the curve on this in terms of the execution, as it says, implementation, talk to implementation. Why has that not happened? What do we need to unlock for that flow of capital to move from the richer countries to the emerging economies, those most vulnerable to climate change?
Yeah, well, I think that's probably political will to assist in that whole process, and development funds, etc., to drive that particular movement between the two styles of economies. But I think for the private sector, these are the banks issuing finance. For the companies trying to fund that finance, it probably doesn't just make a distinction between developed or undeveloped economies. It's where the projects exist. I think that's the important part, where the transition of the economy is existing, where the technology sits. I think that's what's got to attract the finance, and how those companies present themselves, present the opportunity is what's key, and linking the investor to the opportunity. And that's where the new style bonds, the new loans, the new sustainable linked initiatives come through to facilitate that. So I think, to your question, political will is going to drive the movement of capital between the economies, but actually the opportunities are going to come because they are there and banks are willing to lend.
Simone, we've seen over the last decade, from 2013 to today, an increase from less than 100 billion a year in green bond issuance to now $1 trillion in 2022. This clearly signals progress, does it? Or is it still below the curve? How do you assess that progression?
Yeah, I mean, as a percentage of the total, bonds outstanding or bonds being issued, it still might seem small, although, as you say, it has grown enormously over the last, 10 years since we've had the principles, but also since we've seen the first green bond in 2007 by the EIB and then a year later by the World Bank. So this has really grown a lot. And as I said before, we've also seen the interest in the sustainable bonds area, where we've seen growth in also social bonds and sustainability bonds, and the latest instrument being the sustainability linked bond market, which interestingly is also, although it's the newest one, it's the fastest growing one. So green bonds still continue to grow. For social bonds, we've seen the biggest growth during the pandemic, where we've seen a lot of issuance for COVID-related issues. But sustainability-linked bonds are really the biggest growth, and they also continue.
Why is that? What's bringing them into the sort of flavor of the month, if you like?
I guess it's because they have emerged as almost an ideal instrument, if you will, for so-called hard-to-abate sectors. As I said before, a big focus with COP27 now, and also globally in general, when you look at the taxonomies being created and so on, is the transition to being green or being less brown or whatever you want to call it. A reduction in emissions mostly. And we see that a lot of issuers in hard-to-abate sectors such as fossil fuels or shipping or transportation and so on, that they are issuing sustainability-linked bonds to sort of underline what they're saying, underline their transition strategy. You can use SLBs for other things, but mostly we've seen them to finance the transition so far.
Tomas, I wanted to get your thoughts vis-a-vis the region as a whole. The surge in green bonds and associated financing strikes me a lot and reminds me a lot of the wave of Islamic bonds and Islamic financing that came in the noughties, if you like, debt financing coming to the region ultimately for the first time, certainly in the Gulf. I'm wondering how compatible do you think the Gulf and the Middle East is right now, Tomas, for this wave of new sustainable finance?
My view, Sean, I think it is quite right? Because why I'm saying that, it's not a flavor of the month thing. I think to even Damien's point, the political will does seem to be becoming quite important in the region. And with kind of nations setting targets, I think corporates themselves understand that this is not something that is just a flash in the pan or something that is going away. They do see this almost as a fundamental shift in the way of thinking, right? Not just a way of doing things, it's also the way of thinking. And kind of how do you now live in this new paradigm, which is fast approaching. So yes, I mean, my thought is, I think we kind of need to get used that this is something that is, I would say, early stages, but something that is going to come in. And to Simon's point, I think once we have the basics in place, this will be something that is going to see tremendous growth. And it's not just something that is a flavor of the month and it's going to disappear. I think the foundations are being laid not only at a corporate level, actually at a national and a government or a regional level. I think that is what is really going to be driving this bit.
Damien, I welcome your thoughts on the same sort of thesis that we're in a region, the Middle East, particularly the wealthy Gulf region, that has a relatively low debt to GDP ratio. Comparative to the developed economies, it's insignificant, because for a very long time, of course, debt and interest is considered haram, not in alignment with Islamic thinking. As we move through this new green wave, is this region better placed to be a leader, to adopt and adapt to this, or is it the opposite? Is it more of a sort of a frictional engagement because it doesn't have deep debt markets?
No, I understand. Well, I can't comment about the Islamic finance side, but I think what I would say, the Gulf states particularly are in a transition. We have oil-based economies, effectively. Many companies are involved in it in some way, shape or form. The major companies within each of the Gulf states are actually oil companies and extractive companies. So they're not necessarily to be the best type of company traditionally to invest in or lend money to. However, this concept of the transition to assist companies transit, to assist countries transit to the new economies is an important one, and that's where the finance could be therefore focused. So I think we have a great opportunity across the whole of the Gulf because of this change in economies to enable them to move away from oil and gas production, let's say, to new manufacturing, new style of production, and importantly, renewable energy. Many of these are looking to hydrogen and carbon capture type processes, which are very important, are very expensive, and then need those funds. So that's what it's going to attract. That's what's going to bring the money in.
Simone, the situation in the last few months, I mean, it's been a really kind of strange year in so many ways. A year ago, coming out of COP26 in Glasgow, we had the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. acronym. We live in a world of acronyms. GFANS. I'm not quite sure how one even says it, but it does have 550 members right now. And the wave behind the energy transition, as Damien referenced, in the first half or the first few months coming out of COP26 was really quite substantial. But in the second half of this last 12 months, it's really moved in the opposite direction. We've seen a big pushback against ESG. I can't open the Financial Times any day of the week without either the ESG getting a critique or now greenwashing just suddenly has come to the fore in the last even weeks on the doorstep of COP27. Simeon, what's your thoughts on this sort of what appears to be a pushback against ethical investment, green investment, or the like? Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a lot to comment on. Indeed, when you open the press, sometimes it's not clear because especially with the acronym ESG, a lot of people are talking about this and even more so about greenwashing without really perhaps either knowing what they mean or perhaps, different commentators maybe not talking about the same thing. Because
where is the fault in that then? I mean, your organization is a party critical to that communication is clear, people understand concepts. I mean, everybody knows what a bond is. They just don't know what a green bond is. How do we get the language right? What's missing in the communication channels?
Yeah, so when it comes to sustainable bonds, the ICMA principles obviously help. We also every year at our AGM in June, we put out additional guidance, which is often based on, what we see in the market, questions that we get. So our handbook on Q&A gets longer and longer, or bigger and bigger. We have guidance documents on impact reporting, on climate transition finance, and so on. So a lot of guidance out there. But when you talk about ESG, so we don't really talk about ESG because we think it's more of an equity concept, whereas we move in the debt capital markets. But on ESG, I think,
but isn't it the same pushback? Because ultimately the idea of greenwashing and putting yourself forward with a green bond, I mean, as I referenced Islamic finance earlier, there was a period in which Islamic finance got a lot of pushback because it was sort of reconfiguring what was just normal debt financing, giving it a spin because there was this huge capital pool. The same thing is getting a critique on bonds, right? There's a big appetite for green investing, so bonds are painting a color, and so the pushback is emerging.
Yeah, and that is emerging sometimes when the issuers are perhaps not transparent enough. So something that we try to encourage is that for issuers to, follow the guidelines, follow the principles, and then be as transparent with investors and the market as you can be. Also the fourth core component in the use proceeds bond principles, such as green bond principles, is reporting. That is obviously something that is becoming increasingly important to investors, especially the reporting of impact. So issuers should really, not just do the good things from the start and have a green bond framework, for example, but then also see it through and have the annual reporting and have the impact reporting so that investors can really see what is happening with the proceeds and what is happening with their money.
Tomas, the hopes and expectations for COP27 in the climate finance space have got off to a good start. I think we've had this announcement by the UN agency, IFAD, International Fund for Agricultural Development. They've extended a $2 billion facility to the government of Egypt to help in the area of sustainable food security. Of course, a large number of Egyptians depending on small-scale farming, and strangely, only a little over 1% of financing for agri-financing goes to small farmers, who make up a third of food production. So there's a lot of disconnection between money and actual production. Your thoughts and expectations, Tomas, for what COP27 can deliver in climate finance breakthroughs?
Right. I think the whole focus is on implementation, right? As I mentioned, that's the theme that COP is working towards. And I think Simon also alluded to some aspects of that. I think, these elements of standardization, getting in place a uniform taxonomy, I think all of this are going to be the essential building blocks to make sure that the roadmap is clear, there are clear guidelines in place, the guardrails are established, and based on which, let's say the flow can happen much better. Right? Because let me talk selfishly as a bank, right? I mean, we want to be clear in terms of what we are doing. I mean, because we are answerable to our shareholders. So if you're doing something, it needs to be with this kind of clear path and direction. and with this conviction that what we are doing is the right thing to do. And I think COP
where
is
there's
kind
a
of
clear
using that
return
language.
on investment, right? I mean, the ultimate
Yeah.
thing is that there is an economic return to be had here.
That's correct. Yeah, and which also brings us to the interesting project of what kind of projects do we then as a bank finance, right? I think you touched upon that bit also, right? Because let's face it, end of the day, banks will kind of finance those projects which are bankable, right? And I'm using the word bankable. It means there has to be some kind of revenue streams or something, or cash flows that back up that lending that we do as a bank. And but so by definition, that might actually rule out certain kind of projects. It does not rule out all. So it's the kind of what are the projects that are bankable that banks can do, and then there might be a case for a kind of a public sector government intervention on the other projects, and then the kind of third part is probably a blended approach where these are probably projects where both the public and the private can kind of work together and make this happen. That's the kind of way I would look at it.
Damien, part of that sort of challenge that COP and Egypt has identified, and I welcome your thoughts on what some of the breakthroughs could be, is ultimately cutting the costs of financing for eco-friendly projects in Africa and emerging economies. This is the big sort of nut that needs to be cracked. Ultimately, the capital availability at any day of the week for any project in those economies and emerging economies is a challenge. Put another layering of green finance, and so the cost of capital then becomes excessive. The project, as Thomas says, becomes unbankable. How do we square that circle? Can COP27 help? Your thoughts?
I think there's two elements coming out. First of all, there is the concept of the taxonomy. So are the projects really green? To the point you made earlier, and Simone mentioned as well. So are they really green? Are they credible? And that's a very important, this market's only been around for like the last 10 years. It's still in an evolution of trying to define what is green, what isn't green, what's acceptable, some investors and others. And to be honest,
and who has to make that assessment? I know, for example, the IFC have been good leaders in establishing standards and frameworks. Who's going to give us that sort of stamp, that sort of certification?
I think that there's a variety of different bodies. I mean, the principles have put principles out there. The Climate Bond Initiative have created a certification scheme. I was involved in creating that originally. Have the regulators stepping in. It's all inching forward. There's no one body that's going to sign off ultimately. It's going to be a collection of different bodies that investors would recognize the different markets are therefore important. Ultimately, the investors need to be comfortable, and the regulators and the voluntary organizations also need to be comfortable that they can provide that comfort. So I think greenwashing is a problem, but actually getting fundamentally what are good projects and appropriate projects and the financing for it. I think the second thing coming through is the cost of capital side. And I think Simone mentioned earlier, the sustainability linked bonds, a very important one coming through, because they're not necessarily linked to a specific green project. So actually it takes away some of that concept of the project needing to be green. What it's looking at is the company itself raising the money. It's setting a target for itself over a period of time and saying, if we achieve that particular target as a business, then we can reduce the cost of capital. And that's a very important one, because the business is moving forward collectively and wholly to do so. Now, what that means is very good data, very good baseline data, very clear targets, and you have to be able to achieve it, and you have to get proper, robust assurance or some attestation at the end to prove they've met it. But if you do that, then that's the winning scenario. That's where companies can actually say, I want to raise money to do something good for these benefits, and we're all going to share in the benefit of that. So I think taxonomy is important, but also the financing methods and the attractive element to itself.
Simone, just picking up on that, the cost of capital, what impact is this timing having? We're coming into COP27 just as the major monetary policymakers in the world, particularly in the developed economies, are accelerating the cost of capital. We just this week, we expect the Fed to put another 75 basis points on their base rate. How is that impacting this progression, and what can be done to mitigate its impact?
Yeah, obviously, the global geopolitical circumstances and the inflationary environment that we're in, that all puts everyone under pressure, if you will. And it also has an impact on the cost of capital. One thing where that comes into play, for example, there has been a debate for a while now whether when you issue a sustainability linked bond, we see a lot of issuers issue that with a standard 25 coupon ratchet, if you will, if they don't achieve their target, as Damien just mentioned. First of all, it doesn't have to be that kind of structure, but that seems to have emerged as the preferred kind of structure for various reasons, actually. But then also, once you pick that structure, is the 25 basis points, is that really the right amount? First of all, for different kinds of issuers, and secondly, in the current market environment. So, there's a lot of discussions going on around that at the moment, and that, of course, also contributes to the not necessarily accusations of greenwashing, but certainly the debate about is this ambitious enough what the issuer puts out.
Just picking up, Simone, on the question I asked Damien, your thoughts on where do we turn for that certification, that standard, that this what you see on the tin is correct, a green a bond, etc. We had the moral hazard 10 plus years ago now, the great financial crisis of 2008-09. The rating agencies were throwing AAA rating on things that really in the rearview mirror weren't warranted. And there's some sense of that hazard coming back into play given the surge of economic opportunity here. Where do you see that certification, that rating responsibility and assuring that it is credible?
Yeah, so first of all, we have to differentiate between an ESG rating and a certification, right? An ESG rating, like a credit rating, actually looks at the risk or how an issuer deals with the risk. And I think that's also coming back to your earlier question. One of the criticism at the moment, and I think is also a problem with funds, that some people don't understand what an ESG rating really means. Because, contrary to what some people might think, it doesn't say that the company necessarily does any good for the environment or in the social space. It's the other way around, rather, where it's evaluating the ESG risk and how is the company dealing with climate change, for example. The other thing is evaluations. We have something called external reviews, and those are recommended in the principles. There are different kinds of external reviews. The most popular one that typically all issuers have are second-party opinions, which is the acronym SPO, if you haven't ever heard of that. That's something that you get pre-issuance, where a company in that space, the likes of Sustainalytics, ISS, and so on, but also the big rating agencies provide those, S&P, Moody's, and so on, would actually confirm the alignment of the framework with the ICMA principles. And then you can have other types of external reviews. In addition to that, perhaps we just heard about the CBI certification. So the Climate Bonds Initiative actually takes the principles, the ICMA principles, and then adds a taxonomy on top of that to provide us a certification. And then there's also assurances and verifications. Verification, I should say, is actually mandatory for SLBs because the achievement or non-achievement of the target that a company sets out is so important to then trigger this financial element I mentioned, which quite often is a coupon step up.
We're sort of getting into closing comments now. I mean, the good news is 86% of green bonds got external reviews last year, and in part thanks to the guidance issued by the International Capital Markets Association. I just want to focus our last thoughts on this idea of the regional, of the Middle East, of the Gulf, and obviously COP27 now in Egypt and COP28 coming to the UAE next year. How important is the development of green finance contingent on there first being a deep capital markets present, a debt market, even equity market, but just deep capital markets here, and what, do they go together or not? Damien, I'll give you sort of the start of the last word on that.
Yeah. So a number of years ago, when I was back in London, I worked with the City of London as they were trying to set themselves out as a centre for global finance, particularly around green bonds. And we did a report at the time. And what was interesting about that was it wasn't necessarily the depth of the market, it's actually the infrastructure around it that's important. It's having an ecosystem of lawyers, of investment managers, of opportunities, of auditors like myself providing the certification scheme. That ecosystem is actually quite important rather than just necessarily the depth of the market itself, because that supports the identification of opportunity, the knowledge, maturity of the banks trying to issue it, actually the corporates themselves seeking green bonds for themselves, for their own purposes. So I think I'd also argue the ecosystem is probably as important, if not more important, than the depth of the market itself. And that's something that the Middle East hasn't had for a number of years. And only in the last couple of years do we see finance declarations being made, committees set up with the various stock exchanges, the importation of individuals and the skill sets to actually assist in this. So I think this ecosystem building is going to help to drive it forward as much as the deep capital market itself.
Simone, your sort of closing thoughts, and again, in the context of that sort of disconnect, or is it a connection? And with COP27, can it add or help to develop a ecosystem, if you like, in the region that's more conducive to green financing?
Yeah, so first of all, I agree with what Damien just said about this whole ecosystem, and you shouldn't underestimate the role that stock exchanges play as well in Europe. Two major ones are London Stock Exchange and the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, which each have a sustainable bonds section as well. With regards to COP, I don't know if COP specifically will help the development of the sustainable bonds market in the region. COP certainly is, or should focus more on the real world in a way. We've heard that this is supposed to be the COP of implementation now, rather than announcing big commitments. So hopefully we'll see something along those lines. But with regards to green bonds in the region, also social bonds. Social, by the way, is a big element of when we have a sukuk. That will actually hopefully continue because the region really needs to, eventually get away from fossil fuels. We've seen the latest IEA report. Fossil fuels will peak in the next 10 years, and the world should really move more towards renewable energy.
Tomas, the last word with you. Of course, this is a period of time, for better or worse, it is the reality of the world. A large amount of revenue and capital coming into the Middle East at the moment, a large amount of revenue coming into the Gulf. That is capital that can be used in the transition in so many other ways. Your thoughts on that alignment between capital markets and green financing in the region?
Yeah, I think that alignment is important also from a fact of kind of opening up options for people, right? I think the deeper the capital markets, the more options that are there, it'll actually by default bring in more investors and hence broaden the playing field. And once that playing field is opened up, I would say the exchange becomes that much more easier, right? So the flow gets, let's say, lubricated, if I was to use that word. I think that would be my kind of closing thoughts on that.
Well, thank you very much. We're going to wrap it up there. That is the end of our session together, where we are joined with Simone Uttermark, Director of Sustainable Finance with International Capital Market Association. Thank you, Simone. Really great to have your thoughts. And Damien Regan, Sustainability Reporting and Assurance Leader with Deloitte Middle East. Great to have you, Damien, with us. And of course, our host, Thomas Jacob, Senior Vice President, Head of Strategy at Mashreq Bank. This has been the Mashreq Sustainable Finance Dialogues podcast. As we move into the window of COP27, let it deliver all of the hopes and aspirations of all of us individually and collectively as countries and economies and as companies. The pathway forward becomes one of implementation, which is what we need. So thank you all. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Again, on behalf of Mashreq also, let me thank all of you, Simone, Damien, and Sean. Thank you so much for your valuable time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Tomas.
Thank you,
Have a good
Thomas.
day.